very delighted to have you all turn up for this very important seminar that we are hosting here at the World Bank. Our region is very delighted to have a quite interesting array of panelists that are going to help us discuss a very important question that we have asked. Can Africa trade with Africa? Why is this topic important? It is important because in recent times, until the global economic crisis, Africa had begun to grow on a steady path basis, and at least about 5%, I wish it was 5% annually. And then following the economic crisis, that growth dipped to 1.8% in 2009. But unlike many other crises that Africa has experienced, this particular crisis saw a rebound of Africa's growth almost immediately. And so in 2010, our estimate is that Africa is going to grow at least 4.9%. And 2011, 2012, we expect that it goes back to the 5%, above 5% growth levels. This really puts Africa on a different track compared to at least 3 other continents that we know that are growing at less levels. That being the case, one of the important triggers for Africa's hopefully more exponential growth in the future has been the international recognition, as well as the continental recognition that Africa would need to optimize its markets. And that in order for Africa to have larger markets that it can present to the world for competitiveness, it would have to integrate its economies, because of the fact that the growth across Africa is oftentimes uneven, because we've got a taxonomy of countries that include the small, fragile states, very vulnerable, the landlocked countries, it's the continent with the largest lot of them. And so connecting economies and breaking down the barriers that stand in the way of the markets would enable East Africa to present a larger economy to global market space. And that is why we're so delighted to have the senior policymakers from Africa in this room. I really am delighted to welcome the Deputy Chair of the African Union Commission, our dear brother, Erastus Wencha, who has joined us today. We're also very delighted to have those of you that have joined us via the power of technology. I'm talking about technology. This is one thing that Africa is leading the pace in terms of the innovation and the use of technology as a liberating asset for the poor. Regional integration is an important element in the entire Pan-Africa Common Market discussions over the many years of the continent's independence across the respective countries. While the initial focus for Africa's Pan-Africanism seems to be import substitution, today there is a growing consensus that economic integration is indispensable in order for Africa to meet the competitiveness challenges of the global market. Africa's long-term growth will increasingly reflect interrelated social and demographic changes, particularly urbanization, an expanding labor force, and the rise of the middle-class African consumer. In all of these, the important jobs agenda is crucial for any spot of growth that continues to happen on the continent. Promoting intra-Africa trade, therefore, has emerged as a top priority, not just for the global economy, but particularly for the African citizen. African market boasts of at least 1 billion consumers, and it can be a powerful engine for growth and employment, especially now that other markets abroad are contracting. The African Union, the regional economic communities, and the African governments are playing very central roles in accelerating the trade development within Africa through introduction of free trade areas, customs unions, the common markets, and other alignment and harmonization of trade policy reforms. The private sector is beginning to respond to these opportunities. That's what we see from where we sit here at the World Bank. And some of the examples of new investments targeted to intra-regional trade include: 1, the development of global call centers in Kenya as part of the rapidly growing business process outsourcing sector in East Africa. The rapid increase of Mauritius manufactured clothing exports to SADC. The large-scale production of compact fluorescent light bulbs in Lesotho to supply Eskom's energy efficiency drive in South Africa. Large new business investments for infant cereal production in Ghana and for palm oil production in Côte d'Ivoire to supply West African markets. With all these indicators of what could be, it is still early days. And that is why we gathered you here today, because we see that the potential for Africa to really trade with Africa and to use that as the first phase towards its greater integration into the global marketplace is huge. Only about 10% of Africa's trade is within the continent as of now, compared to about 40% in North America and about 60% in Western Europe. While Africa's trade to China increased by a record 61% per year between 1999 and 2006, trade within Africa grew only by a paltry 14% per year. Our discussion today will therefore require our panelists to tell us from their perspective how we can make Africa trade more with Africa. Our panelists bring a very diverse perspective from their background. And it is a mesh of government, the private sector, policy leaders. And I would like to immediately say that we will operate under the Ezekwesilin rules. And the Ezekwesilin rules, this is the rule that requires everybody to be frank, candid, and to be entirely honest about their perspective. And above all, to be provocative in the exchange, because that's the way we're going to be able to find the solutions. It gives me pleasure to introduce our panelists. I want to first introduce our dear Minister of Finance from South Africa, our very good friend, Pravin Gordhan. Pravin is a very experienced policymaker. Previously the Commissioner of South Africa's Revenue Service from 1999 to 2009, and chair of the World Customs Organization between 2000 and 2006. Pravin has been a very intellectual person in terms of looking at the issues of development. He was at the center of the political process that gave birth to South Africa's democracy, including co-chairing the transitional executive council that ushered in the first democratically elected government, and playing a lead role in the drafting of South Africa's new constitution. We're so delighted to have you. I want to introduce Bill Edward. Bill is a senior manager for Coca-Cola in Africa for the past 13 years. And he's recognized as a regional leader and a very influential one at that in the supply chain activities in Africa. He's currently the president of Coca-Cola in South Africa, and he's head of their Pan-Africa initiatives. And earlier, he was the president for East and Central Africa for Coca-Cola. Lead member of the Private Investors for Africa, which is a business coalition of ethically like-minded companies committed to contributing to the continent's future. Bill has always been at our beck and call because of the clear ideas on how private sector can be partners in development. And so we're very delighted to have you in our midst again, Bill. And then we have with us Tony Elumelu. Tony is my compatriot, being one of Nigeria's foremost bankers. Tony, until recently, was the group managing director, the chairman, the CEO, and everything of UBA, the United Bank for Africa, which has evolved into one of the leading Pan-African financial institutions. And he was recently recognized by BCG as one of the 40 African champions. Tony is currently the chairman of Hares Holdings, and this is an investment company that operates a diverse portfolio across Africa. Tony created recently the Tony Elumelu Foundation. This is very good. We're beginning to sound like the Bill Gates Foundation of this world, and that's important for Africa because it shows progress. So Tony, we're very delighted to have you. We would be joined ultimately by another speaker, Rosa Whitaker. We hope she eventually makes it here. But I have a good friend in the house, Paul Collier. Paul is back to his domain because Paul was part of the World Bank, but he's currently better known for the bottom billion. Paul is a professor of economics and director for the Center for the Study of African Economies at Oxford University. And he served as the director of development and economic research, development economic research in the bank between 1998 and 2003. He's an influential thinker. Paul is an authority on Africa. I think he's someone who mixes research with the heart. And so he's able to state it exactly as it is. We will thank him for The Bottom Billion, published in 2007, Wars, Guns, and Votes. There was a thing called Wars, Guns, and Roses or something. I sometimes mistook one for the other. And then recently you published The Plundered Planet. We want to thank you for coming. And then finally, Maxwell. Maxwell Kwezalamba is our very good brother, who is the Commissioner for Economic Affairs at the African Union Commission. And he's leading the team to really work both with the G20, the G8, the international financial institutions, the NEPAD, and the respective countries to see how we can move faster on economic integration, monetary policy, and private sector development within the continent. Until he took his position, he used to be the permanent secretary for Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning in Malawi, and he did work for the World Bank. So thank you very much. Now that we have the introductions out of the way, let me get this going because I know you're going to be leaving us soon. Let me ask you, Praveen, when people talk about regional integration, do you think the rhetorics match the action?
Really putting me on the spot. Well, firstly, thank you for the invitation to be here with you. And the answer is no. The action doesn't match the rhetoric. And let me answer the other question. Can Africa trade with Africa? Yes. But there's a whole series of buts after that as well. And perhaps that's you asked us to be frank. So that's perhaps one of the challenges that we have in Africa. That we have too many declarations and too many pronouncements and too little action, which meaningfully places the continent on a new footing. And in leading up to that, let me say a few words about the world in which we find ourselves in which Africa finds itself in. It's a world in which there's a desperation. It doesn't come across in that way, but that's true. About where is this global economy going? Who is going to drive it? Is it going to be driven in the same way as it was driven for the past 100 years? And are there important forces of change and transition that are operating? And the answer to the latter question is yes, there are important changes that are happening. But the question is, how does Africa locate itself within those changes? Today, everyone talks about multipolarity, about searching for new sources of growth, new sources of sites of investment, and new sources of demand. And yet, both ideological and cultural factors inhibit a recognition of Africa as one of the continents where this could actually happen. I said yesterday in another forum that a few words about the world in which we find ourselves in and in which Africa finds itself in. It's a world in which there's a desperation. It doesn't come across in that way, but that's true. About where is this global economy going? Who is going to drive it? Is it going to be driven in the same way as it was driven for the past 100 years? And are there important forces of change and transition that are operating? And the answer to the latter question is yes, there are important changes that are happening. But the question is, how does Africa locate itself within those changes? Today, everyone talks about multipolarity, about searching for new sources of growth, new sources of sites of investment, and new sources of demand. And yet, both ideological and cultural factors inhibit a recognition of Africa as one of the continents where this could actually happen. I said yesterday in another forum that at least when people look at the world map now, Africa seems to have the light on. For many decades, you look everywhere else, but Africa doesn't quite appear in the consciousness of people. But today, it's a different proposition, but it's a proposition that needs to be earned further by the kinds of things that we actually do. The second point that goes with this is nobody is going to help Africa unless Africa helps itself. And therefore trade with Africa, so to speak, is as important as trade with anybody else. But the numbers seem to show, and you refer to some of them, will be, that we still have more trade between Africa and the rest of the world than within Africa itself. And part of the reason for that is our own legacy of extraction from Africa. And so Paul's book about Planet Funded is also something that can refer to Africa Funded, because there's a lot more extraction happening in Africa, from Africa, than there is, if you like, investment and plowing that is happening in the African continent. Ultimately, Africa's got to learn that none of us as individual countries is going to win this competitive war to grow our economies, create jobs, fight poverty, and create a better life for all, unless we approach it on a win-win basis. And the quicker we can establish an ethos in Africa which says what the mechanics of establishing a win-win approach are, the better for ourselves in terms of advancing not only trade but development within Africa itself. So clearly, on the African continent, our approach must be one which promotes interdependency or recognizes interdependency. It promotes partnerships. You refer to Lesotho and South Africa, and the factory in Lesotho that manufactures energy-saving bulbs, but it's largely sold in South Africa. But that's one very small example, and not good enough in terms of the magnitude of the challenges that we face currently. But equally importantly, if Africa becomes the same as the colonial powers that operated in Africa, meaning the benefits of trade and the benefits of development and the benefits of growth are shared by a minority, we'll be back to square one in a slightly different form. So one of the things that we've also got to do is ask, as we grow our economies and develop our plans, how are those benefits to be shared more widely? How do we create more jobs, as we pointed out? And how do we reduce poverty by ourselves, let alone by receiving aid from somebody else? Perhaps an important recognition today is that I think in the next 5 or more years, we're going to see a shift taking place from aid to investment, from short-term view of what is going on in Africa to a longer-term connection, if you like, and investment in Africa. Manufactures energy-saving bulbs, but it's largely sold in South Africa. But that's one very small example, and not good enough in terms of the magnitude of the challenges that we face currently. But equally importantly, if Africa becomes the same as the colonial powers that operated in Africa, meaning the benefits of trade and the benefits of development and the benefits of growth are shared by a minority, we'll be back to square one in a slightly different form. So one of the things that we've also got to do is ask, as we grow our economies and develop our plans, how are those benefits to be shared more widely? How do we create more jobs, as we pointed out? And how do we reduce poverty by ourselves, let alone by receiving aid from somebody else? Perhaps an important recognition today is that I think in the next 5 or more years, we're going to see a shift taking place from aid to investment. A short-term view of what is going on in Africa to a longer-term connection, if you like, and investment in Africa. And so the challenges for us is how do we create the institutions, the infrastructure, the human capability, and processes in Africa which will enable us to capture those possibilities before they pass us completely. I think Asia and Latin America are giving us some examples of what regional integration could mean. The challenge on the African continent is that we talk of regional formation, and then what we do is that one country could belong to 3 regions. Now, that's not going to help us. That just creates a formula for more problems as we actually go on. And so, how do we create a political maturity, if you like, amongst ourselves, so that we don't engage in that kind of activity? I think we have on paper the right ambitions, but the act on the ground doesn't quite follow the ambition or the aspiration. So the ambition is to firstly form units of regional integration, south, east, west, north, whatever. Secondly is to create a free trade area within each of those regions. Thirdly, to get some form of integration amongst those free trade areas. And somewhere in the long term, let's talk about a customs union in Africa. But what we will do is get together at conferences and say we want the customs union this year. And we know that we haven't done the groundwork for it. And often our own ambitions and the necessity to make politically correct statements doesn't quite help us to diligently plan and do that which is necessary in order to create the right conditions for effective trade in Africa. The second major shift I think we need to make is to overcome our own colonial legacy, as I mentioned earlier on, which is you can't just have extraction of raw materials or resources from Africa and sent out elsewhere. As a short-term measure, that's fine. But we do need to sit with the Paul Colliers of the world and others, and the World Bank as well, otherwise she'll get upset with me. So that we can now come up with medium-term plans which can effectively say to us, how do we build internal capacity, how do we beneficiate those resources within our own countries and environments, but also recognizing that we are a highly fragmented continent because of our colonial legacy. How do we build these interdependencies in a way in which not every one of us wants an airline? Not every one of us wants a stock exchange. And I can repeat, and I'm sure Mr. Egbe and others will tell you more about this. But if we follow that formula, that's a formula to the bottom, not a formula to the top. So we have to give and take a little bit and truly create regional institutions which will help us to overcome that very colonial legacy that we actually talk about. But over and above that, we also need to create conditions where we both develop a capacity to make things in Africa that other Africans want to have and buy, but also create the markets and the movement capacity of goods and merchandise and maybe even raw materials to move around the continent in an effective way. And again, the World Bank and others can actually help us to understand how do we actually overcome, if you like, the information asymmetry within Africa. Because there's a huge asymmetry. In other words, people sitting outside Africa know a lot more about us than we know about ourselves. And they know a lot more about where the possibilities are in Africa than we know ourselves where those possibilities are. If we find where are the regional institutions that can help us to overcome the information asymmetries, that excites the possibility of strategic innovation. That excites the possibility of all other kinds of initiatives, both from the private sector, the public sector, and multilateral institutions within Africa to overcome some of our challenges. Then let me end by saying that on the customs front, exactly 10 years ago, South Africa took the initiative to create an Africa-wide customs federation, if you like to call it that. Today, it's a sub-body within the African Union Trade Commission. But that was an initiative which I think brought in eventually 35 countries, and after year after year after year of building, it took about 5 years to build a momentum where at least 35 countries would attend annual customs conferences. You now have somewhat of a continental structure. But again, like happens with some human beings, we build things and we let it slip rather than sustain it. So how do we create sustainable institutions is another challenge that we have. I think there are lots of ideas on the African continent and outside about how to make customs barriers lower, about how to lower freight costs, about how to expedite the movement of goods and to lower the tendency amongst customs administrations to do too much of paperwork or put too much of money in the pockets of customs officials, and thereby both delay trade but also make trade more costly. But the challenge again, like in many things that Africa faces, is can we convert the idea to concrete action on the ground and build processes and institutions and the human capability which will enable us to sustain something over 20 years. And perhaps we need to borrow from the Spence Commission when they talk about 7% growth over 20 years and ask the question, if we had to, in this room, get locked up for a day with 3 meals provided by the World Bank, what sort of ideas would we come up with to actually develop a plan which will give us 7% growth over a 20-year period, but shared equitably amongst all of the countries and all of the classes of people that we have in a society, so that we have truly growth which delivers social justice on one hand, but also gives us, within governments and the private sector, the edge that we require. So I look forward to the plan that you'll come up in 24 hours. Thank you very much.
But, you know, I'm not going to let you off like that, because everything you said suggests that at the technical level and in terms of ideas, we do have a sense of the things that work. We do have examples of nations that have gone ahead of us, continents that have gone ahead of us. And so, whether it's in terms of the policies that would be required for integration, whether it's in terms of the investments that we would need to make, or whether it's in terms of the institutions that would underpin this, that we know a lot about what to do. And that what remains is for the politicians, the leaders, to take us from aspiration to action. And frankly, dear friend, Ravi, you're one of the powerful leaders of the continent. So, what's going to happen?
I thought I threw the challenge out to you, now you're throwing it back to me. I tried to be very diplomatic and not mention politicians or anybody else. What needs to happen is, firstly, let's rationalize those regional formations. And every country in 6 months must choose which one do you belong to. And Mr. Kweza Lamba is going to help us to do that. Second thing is to make sure that all the FTAs work within each of the regions. The third is to look at what infrastructure is required in terms of rail or road or air in order for certain key spots within the African continent to be connected, so that you have nodes of, if you like, access and distribution. And I'm sure that if the World Bank and the AU put their heads together, within 6 months we'll have a map of exactly where that is. The fourth is that any investment that happens in Africa around these sorts of issues must now always be on a regional basis and not on a country basis. So the emphasis now must move to regional infrastructure, and a different kind of package needs to be created to support countries for their country infrastructure. That's dangerous for me to say. I might get shot for that. But unless we make some of those breaks, we aren't going to be able to, if you like, lay the foundation that we actually require. The fifth is to create a set of bureaucrats in Africa who understand that unless they can imbibe and demonstrate the same urgency, the same commitment, and the same imagination as countries that are growing faster and doing things at an extraordinary pace elsewhere in the world, I won't name them, we will be failing the people of Africa. It's not just the politicians. The politicians make decisions, but the bureaucrats are supposed to deliver them. And the private sector is supposed to connect with them and work with them. So how do we create the right connections amongst them and the right mindsets and orientation which will help us to advance? Now all of these things, I can carry on, but all of these things are doable in 6 months. But it's up to you to do it.
And you know what? I didn't even have to pay for 24-hour breakfast, lunch, and dinner before he came up with the things that we would have to do. So it's really good that you started us off giving us this kind of important context of the politics, the political economy, and the policy nexus of what we're discussing. So I know that you may have to take your leave at some point, but this really throws us into the part where I need to turn to you, Bill. You just had Minister Previn, and you actually run Coca-Cola operation from South Africa. Now, does that resonate in terms of the kinds of constraints that you're seeking for countries in leadership? If you look at regional integration, you think Nigeria, you think South Africa, and you just imagine what their growth would mean for the smaller countries. Does any of this resonate with you?
Absolutely. Madam Chair, first of all, thank you for convening this seminar. I think the bottom line is that we don't need new solutions. We know what needs to be done. We have all the policy frameworks, all the policy documents. And what we need to start holding ourselves accountable for is to deliver against these. And I'm talking about not just the politicians and the bureaucrats, but the participants in the private sector and civil society. Ultimately, we know that for Africa to develop a little bit faster than it has up to this point, we have to broaden the base, the economic base on the continent. And it's not going to happen because of government projects or what multinational companies do, but it's going to happen because we encourage entrepreneurs and small and medium enterprises to thrive on the continent. And for these kinds of businesses to thrive on the continent, we need to provide a conducive environment for them to be able to produce their goods and services and sell them to a broader market than their local village or town, and be able to sell that across borders. It is fundamental. And it goes to the fact that we need to have a development that is broad-based, which enables all the levels of society to be able to benefit from this development. And you can only do that if you encourage entrepreneurship on the continent. So when we talk about the policies to promote intra-Africa trade, we have everything we need. But until we start holding individuals and institutions accountable and responsible for delivering those with clear metrics and timelines, we'll continue having these seminars and discussions without making progress. It is not that difficult to point out who exactly is responsible for delivering what within which time frame, and then making them accountable for doing that. That's what works in the private sector. We get the result very quickly. And I think until we cross that bridge and hold people accountable for delivering against these objectives, we're not going to make progress. Secondly, I believe the private sector has a bigger responsibility on the role that they have to play in contributing to these agendas. First of all, I believe companies who do business in Africa should come to Africa with the mindset that we have a broader agenda beyond extracting minerals or planting food and selling abroad or providing services. We're able to make money on the continent, but we also have to invest back into the continent, which means we create meaningful long-term jobs on the continent. We choose partners who are based on the continent, we help them build skills, and we invest in reinforcing the institutions we have on the continent. I think it's important that we have companies that have that view when they come onto the continent. But for them to make the investments on the continent, they need to be given broader markets. We have a very fragmented continent, a lot of sub-scale markets. The Coca-Cola company in Africa has 163 plants in 53 countries. Do we need 163 plants? No. We could supply the continent with half as many plants. But when you put all the border controls, you cannot move products across borders. There are all kinds of restrictions, even within common trade zones. So you multiply the infrastructure that you have to build on the continent to serve the continent. That imposes costs on the continent and the consumers who have to buy those goods. So it's an imperative for us that as we look at improving inter-Africa trade, we look at some of the small obstacles that we put by not implementing the policies that we have in our regional trade agreements and customs unions. As simple as that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bill. You know, I often hear many Africans sort of say, if only we had the capital, if we had access to finance, we would, you know, get the sun to shine. Tony, you've been at the heart of trying to move finance across the continent. You heard part of what Bill said, broaden the market. Let there be the economies of scale so that operations can operate from particular countries and serve many other countries. In your financial activities across the continent, what do you pick up? And where are the opportunities in hastening the pace?
I think first let me thank you and the World Bank for this opportunity. It's very good that we start engaging and discussing this one. For me, capital is not everything. Capital is important, but it's just one of those things we need to do. If you look at the statistics of trade in Africa, we did recently about $8 trillion. 10% of this was not intra-Africa. And if you look at the breakdown of actual export, we have commodities accounting for about 65%. Oil, 40%. Agri produce, 25%. So that's 65%. It means what is available to be traded actually in Africa is within the context of 25%. You have extraction, as the minister said. You have processing, and you have export. The African economy is completely locked out in the middle chain of processing. And that is where significant value is created. That is where employment is generated. That is where income per capita will actually go up. That has a more significant impact on the actual world. What you can see is completely out. So I'm asking myself, what do we need to fix this now? Is it just capital? It's not just capital. Capital is important, but not, as they say, function necessary for us to condition. I believe that as Africans, we need to do a couple of things. If you give an African SME a certain amount of money that he or she requires to run a business, will that business succeed or survive the harsh operating environment like I said? So I would think before we begin to talk about finance, let's fix some of these. have research, and the users lock us up in 24 hours and maybe within 24 hours people. But I have some ideas. There are, if you look at agri, you don't need the kind of capital you need for oil and gas to extract or to process agri produce. So maybe we can look at that area and grow the SME. We can have government and the export credit agency, the appraising, give a kind of guarantee to companies that are in this sector. Commercial banks cannot operate like development banks. Commercial banks will make sure they mitigate the risks they take. But the export guarantee banks can support players in this sector. I also believe that, as someone said before, we need to identify key sectors in the African economy that have, like power sector, because there's so much you can do. The SMEs in the agri area cannot do much if they don't have power. Storage will become a major issue for them. And so we know that the transportation is a key issue. Before they transport their goods from the hinterland to the port is all destroyed. So there's so much to do for capital is important. Now, speaking specifically about the question of experience we have across Africa, the experience is that we have the multinationals that operate in Africa, access to credit is not difficult for them. But we have the SMEs, access to credit is very difficult because the collateral they have cannot meet the commercial bank collateral requirements. So the point is, what reforms do we have to put in place to make those collaterals viable and acceptable to banks? Just like what when you and your team were in Nigeria tried to do a couple of things about the Land Act, Land Use Act. We have so much resources in Africa that we have not been able to monetize. So we need to get the African political leaders together and put in place the right piece of legislation that will help the SME use some of these collaterals in a way and manner that they can leverage the collateral to obtain. And I also believe that capacity building is very important. And for us, I think African leaders, private sector, public sector should come together to realize that we need to fix capacity building. But most of these SMEs that we have in the agri space, they don't know how to do something. So we need to ask.
That's wonderful. Thank you so very much. Well, I'm going to come to you because I'm just leaving you as the great professor who is taking in all of this. And then you give us your analytical calibration of everything we've been hearing. But let me turn to a very good friend, Rosa Whitaker. Rosa has been able to join us. Rosa was the mover of the Africa Opportunity Growth Act, the AGOA. And I saw an article where you took umbrage at the fact that anyone would dare say that AGOA hasn't achieved what it intended to achieve. And part of the reason is because post your life as the assistant trade representative responsible for Africa during both the presidency of President Bush as well as President Clinton, you have been attracting investment into Africa. And so far, you actually have been able to do as much as $1 billion of investment across the continent. Now tell me. What could be different?
Thank you, Madam Chairperson, and let me also join others in applauding you for this important discussion. First, I want to say, on the 10-year anniversary of AGOA this year, we have seen that for a nominal U.S. investment, and most people don't realize, AGOA only costs the U.S. taxpayer $2 million a year. And for that nominal investment, In 10 years, we've created 300,000 jobs on the continent and about $30 billion in non-oil African exports to the U.S. Whether we're talking about the $2 billion in cars from South Africa, or the apparel from Kenya and Lesotho, or we're talking about cut flowers, this is I think a significant return on investment. And when we wrote AGOA, we did have regional integration in mind. That is why we put in AGOA general rules of origin to encourage accumulation. That's why you see even in some of the products from South Africa, we find Zambian imports, and Lesotho, Zambian cotton. But the most important thing is the way forward. I think you summed it up when you talked about building on what works. And I think we have a proposal called Enterprise for Development that I am pretty confident, and I would bet my reputation that it will work. And it's a follow-on to AGOA. And basically what we're asking for is three things, and it intersects what others have talked about. One, we want to make AGOA permanent because it expires in 2015. Two, it may be difficult, but I think it's doable. And that is to open up the U.S. tax code. So we are asking for U.S. tax incentives, three types. One, the repatriation of profits for any U.S. company that invests in sub-Saharan Africa in a non-oil, non-mineral sector. Because right now, companies respond to tax incentives. Two, we would like tax credits for any U.S. company retailers that sources products out of Africa. And an extra benefit if you source products with significant regional African content. And so we know that would cost the U.S. taxpayers less than $8. And three, we have an initiative called Services for Development, because I believe that the next job-creating sector in Africa is going to be the BPO sector. So how can we incentivize, especially with the work we see going on in East Africa, and with the costs now in Africa being comparable, if not better, for business processing as in India. So how can we incentivize that sector with a tax incentive that would provide U.S. companies with a development tax benefit for doing their outsourcing, or we can find a more politically correct word, in Africa, because it's job creating, it would cost the U.S. very little. And the third thing that we are proposing, we have these regional trade capacity hubs in Africa. I think largely they've been a failure. I think that our aid program is a failure. I think that we so focus on the quantity of aid that we don't look at the quality. I think we need to look at our aid. Only 44 cents on every dollar of U.S. Western aid in Africa ever hits the ground. And what we have is aid leading the vision as opposed to the African vision leading the aid. And what we have developed is an aid industrial complex of NGOs that have created parallel structures in Africa. And it is just fraught with all kinds of problems. So what we're talking about in our proposal is that we know that no country in the world has developed without a strong indigenous private sector and strong institutions. So let's devote our aid money to building those private sector institutions, because this aid industrial complex have created some very perverse incentives. And I see it every time when I'm on the ground, when I see very capable African business leaders that may need a little extra money, like you referred to, Tony, serving as chauffeurs for NGO leaders, because that's the way the incentives are set up. So that is what we feel is the way forward that could really make a significant difference, and maybe looking at our aid going to budget support, because the budget support does reflect the national development plans for African countries. And if you're concerned about corruption, as everyone says, we can, I agree with Dr. Collier, send in the accountants. Make that a condition. Send in your own accountants to watch your money. But by all means, let's have more money hit the ground in Africa.
All right, thank you very much. You raised very interesting points. The right person to respond to some of this would be Paul. I know that Paul has been very much into, I'm holding you because frankly, there's a lot of problems we're going to be solving as the African Union Commission. We can't discuss regional integration and have you go first. You have to listen to everybody and then tell us how you're going to solve all the problems that are put on the table. So Paul, I talked to you I talk to you as a foremost academic who has, done quite a lot of simulations in terms of where the opportunities lie as far as Africa is concerned, and analyze the constraints and how they can be overcome. You have a lot of what has been said here today. You have the final thing that our dear friend Rosa said. I don't think that the conversation is, should it be aid, or should it be trade, or should it be investment? It should be everything, but done in a way that is complementary and able to enable the growth. But you can say this better than I do.
I doubt it. When you called me the great professor, it reminded me of what I learned from President Wilkinson. Sometimes, when I came out with something he thought was really pretty smart, he called me Paul. And when I came out with something he thought was truly idiotic, he called me Professor.
Very good.
Now, let's get started. The first thing is that all actors, international and domestic, have got to think both wider and smaller than the nation state. It's the region, which is wider, and it's the city, which is smaller. The name of economic growth is regions and their cities. I've done a bit of work comparing the structure of city sizes in Africa and India. Africa, the whole population is quite a bit less than India. But Africa's 53 countries and India's 1. And that political fragmentation then shows up big time in what cities you've got. Because big cities need big hinterlands. And so India has, I think, 3 megacities over 20 million. Africa does not. And it goes on down. The whole structure of African city size is smaller and weaker because of that political fragmentation. I've done the sort of fancy work, you can say, it's caused, right? Political fragmentation has reduced city size in Africa a lot. Now, why does that matter? Because there's a clear relationship globally between city size and the productivity of people in them. Big cities are there because it makes people more productive. You move somebody from a tiny village to a big city, and you've got a very substantial increase in productivity. Approximately every time you double the size of the town, you get around a 6 to 8% increase in productivity per person. So Africa, the political fragmentation has trapped people into these tiny cities. Now, the punchline is it's not a zero-sum game. You form regions instead of just isolated nations, and nearly all cities get bigger. It's not a zero-sum game in which one city gets bigger and another gets smaller. They nearly all get bigger. This is win-win. And moving from Africa as it is to Africa as it could be, looking integrated like India, will produce these huge gains in productivity. So that's the first thing. Think wider, regions, narrower cities. And that's a message not just to African leaders in Africa, it's to the whole international community, including you, Vice President. The second point, what can we've then got to think, if we focus at the region, we've got to think infrastructure for the region. But it's not just a matter of building it. There's I think possibly too much naivety at the moment in focusing on building transport infrastructure. It's also running it. It's got to be run. I mean, in a way, you've got this huge excitement of China's got to build Africa's transport infrastructure. You know what? Been there, done that. It's called Tazara. I think all these deals should be done under the slogan, no more Tazaras. Right? Try getting from Zambia to Dar on Tazara. Right? And allow yourself a long time to do so. So it's got to be got to focus on the running of the things as well as the building. And the third thing is that it's not enough just to have the physical infrastructure to move things. Most of the impediments are not physical, they're policy induced. You know, the border restrictions. And here, since we're licensed to be frank, African governments have got a credibility problem. They announce much more than they delivered, and having done that repeatedly on the trade is going to be, barriers are going to be lifted, but they're still there. That is the makings of a mega credibility problem. Now, what do you do when you're faced with a credibility problem? First of all, you face it. You don't deny it. Face reality. You have a credibility problem. It's not enough now to make another pronouncement that borders will be free. You know, movement will be free. Nobody's going to believe it, and so the investment won't be. So you need commitment technologies. You need ways of committing yourselves. And what a commitment technology is when you say something that you mean, you build in parallel with it some device which means if you break your word, it hurts. That's what you do when you're serious about making statements. And if you're not serious, don't make the statements. The African Union can do a lot in building those commitment technologies, quite possibly in alliance with the World Bank. Because as I say, the essence of a commitment technology is if you break your word, it hurts you. Let me give a real example of where the lack of a commitment technology really messed up the infrastructure. Now we've heard from Mr. Efe here, buried in what he said is a dramatic statement that Coca-Cola needed twice as many plants, I think you said, as you should need to serve the African market. Think of the cost implications. Now the example I've got is of resource extraction in Guinea. A major resource discovery in Guinea, which the way to get the efficient way to get the way to get the iron ore out, much the closest was a railway to Buchanan.
Extraction was going to be $6 billion, of which $4 billion was entirely due to the decision not to use the port of Buchanan. So here was a major project which tripled in cost, $4 billion, that's more than the entire GNP of Liberia at the time, wasted because of the absence of political commitment technology. I think this bell probably means I should start. The same is true of negotiations between Malawi and Mozambique over railways at the moment.
Please, can I just say, the next step in AGOA, as well as all the fine things that Rosa suggested, the world can learn from AGOA. Let's make it global. Let's get all the OECD countries to do a super AGOA. Because trade with the rest of the world from Africa complements, not competes, with trade within Africa. So, super AGOA. This should be on the G20 agenda next time.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Well, now, Maxwell, you had, I'm so glad that Paul said exactly what needed to be said in terms of there has to be a real cost for not delivering on the many political statements that have been made. And that cost will become the incentive that people have to actually deliver. I think your work is cut out for you. The next AU President's Summit is going to be in January. I think Pravin said it, just simply reduce the number of wrecks that are all over the place, with countries belonging to a multiple of them. That is well within your power to do. And you're supported by the Deputy Chair, Wencha. I mean, it would be great if this meeting could say that one thing you took away is that you're going to do it, and then we all hold you accountable for it. Over to you.
No, thank you very much, Bobby, and let me also take this opportunity to thank you for inviting me to this very interesting panel. And indeed, a number of questions have been raised. The challenges have been presented, but it's really a question of how we address these challenges as African Union, as World Bank, as well as other institutions. I entirely do agree with those that are of the view that indeed, a number of decisions have been made that would lead to Africa trading with itself, that would lead to accelerating regional integration within the continent. But indeed, the problem that we have is that one of implementation. And I think the problem of implementation really also arises from the fact that you have decisions made, but a lot of times there seems to be a gap between those that make the decisions and those that are supposed to implement these decisions. And I think this is something that we as African Union would need to work on. There are issues surrounding some of the constraints. The problem of the multiple membership of the RECs, for example. This is indeed a challenge for us on the continent, in our case to accelerate regional integration. You have countries belonging to at least one REC, 2, 3 regional economic communities. And each time they go to one REC, they would make commitments regarding what needs to be done within that community in move forward the regional integration agenda. And then they would go to another REC, again make commitments to similar things, but then probably with different timeframes, and it creates problems when it comes to implementation. There have been some decisions regarding how to address this problem, but I must say that it is a serious challenge. And what maybe we could focus on is to learn from the experiences of COMESA, SADC and East African Community, whereby the focus has been more on trying to harmonize policies and programs as well as activities. With this, they have agreed to establish a free trade area, and there is technical work that is going on. Praveen did talk about leaders taking a decision regarding belonging to this REC or not. This has been proved extremely difficult, I must say. In 2006, we had a whole summit dedicated to rationalization and harmonization of the regional economic communities. And
When?
In 2006.
Last time I checked, this is 2010.
Well, yes, exactly. 2006, in the Gambia, we had a summit devoted to this particular subject matter because the heads of state were of the view that this indeed needed to be addressed. But I must say that I can only remember one country that took a decision to pull out of one REC. The rest did not pull out of any of these RECs before. So this is a serious challenge, and probably working with yourselves, this is something that we need to look at seriously. But for the tripartite arrangement that we have, among COMESA, SADC, and ESC, this is something that we feel could be emulated, and therefore we should also try as much as possible to work with other regional economic communities in having this done. Already, I know we have ECAS and CEMAC that have agreed to look into having a similar arrangement. Let me also agree with those that are saying that we need to address the issue of infrastructure. This is indeed key, but I think the question of focusing on regional infrastructure is very pertinent. The thinking that we have is that most of the facilities that are there, be they from probably the World Bank, do not have much of this regional infrastructure financing component. I believe this is something that we need to look at, developing an instrument that would finance regional infrastructure projects. I know there are also challenges. The challenges facing institutions such as the bank would probably relate to how the countries would get together to agree on how they are going to partition the loan among or between themselves. These are the challenges that we face, but I think these can be easily addressed, and therefore we need to look at this matter seriously. There are also issues surrounding what we in Africa are producing. A lot of times we are focused on producing agricultural commodities, mineral products, and so trading between African countries, trading among African countries presents a serious challenge. And I think we need to work on how we can diversify African economies. And I believe using expertise of the bank, working with the African Union Commission, we should be able to come up with policies and strategies that could be implemented by the African Union member states to ensure that the structures of their economies are diversified. But I must say that indeed there was a statement that was made that yes, we do have a number of these policies, a number of plans that are there, but the issue is one to do with implementation. I think we need to look at what do we need to do to ensure that countries implement all these policies and strategies that probably have been discussed and agreed upon at fora like this one, or fora of ministers of finance and planning, to make sure that they they are implemented and move forward the integration agenda. And then I would also want to say something regarding again, this relates to the issue of implementation. I think like the World Bank, you have programs that you're supporting with our countries. But one also has to maybe understand whether within those programs you do have regional integration programs. I think this is something that we need to look at. A lot of times the focus has only been on addressing issues at the local level. But I think we need to see how best we can bring in this regional integration agenda in the programs that we do have with the member states. And I think this, I leave it to the bank to address. The issue of political commitment. Yes, these decisions are being taken. So at the political level, I would say there is that commitment. But when it comes to implementation, it is a serious challenge. I remember one example, traveling with an AU, let's say, per se, going to one country that I know is very much committed to integration. I mean, when I arrived, they could not accept my AU, let's say, passport. I did tell them about the decision that has been taken by the heads of state and government regarding using this AU, let's say, passport. And they simply said, sorry, we are not aware of it. We take decisions up there, and your decisions are not brought to our attention. And that was it. I was stuck there. Somebody else had to come from protocol to rescue me. So these are issues that I think need to be addressed. So political commitments versus those that are supposed to do things on the ground. And I think the AU could need to work on this. But I think, as I said, some of these issues would also require that we work very closely with yourselves. So these are some of the points that I thought I should raise. But we do have a serious challenge. But if we address these problems, I'm sure we should be able to promote intra-African trade.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I think that's why we need to move urgently so that your laissez-passer can work. And then for a number of the private entrepreneurs that really want to be able to move across countries on the continent, they would have this free movement of persons, of goods, of services. That's really what's going to create the opportunity for the development. I could suggest something immediately as a takeaway. Why don't we have a summit of the presidents that's not on any topic, but a compilation of all the decisions regarding regional integration that has been taken over time. And that summit basically is a summit to determine timelines, the deliverables, and accountability for delivery. And as Paul said, put the cost for non-delivery.
And one more thing, so that we begin to shift from the usual practice, engage a few private sector from Africa, a few of them from the regional bloc. So like East Africa, South Africa, Central Africa, West Africa, like 2 or 3 each. And let everyone come. Should be entrepreneurs who do business across, not just in their country, but across regions. So let them come and engage with the government there's need, I believe, the government begins to see the true benefits of some of these policies they will buy into. The problem is buy into the policy.
That's great. I was going to now expand this, and I was going to call on you first. Audience, you've been listening to, I don't know about you, but I've really been enjoying having to listen to the different perspectives that have come from policymakers, from regional integration people like Maxwell, and then from private sector. And then, of course, from people like Rosa, who represent the spectrum of outsiders that have done policy-related issues with the continent and then become practitioners trying to bring investment into the continent. But more important is that in this room, we have many of you that have one idea or the other on this regional integration discussion. So my second point is, we've heard them say, yes, Africa can trade with Africa. Now, what are your thoughts? What are your questions? Well, let's start with Deputy Chair, Wencha.
Thank you very much, Bobby, and as usual, this is a very important topic for Africa, because as you said, if there are enablers for African integration, it is trade. And we want to thank you for that foresight and for bringing us together. I'm going to do a bit of blowing one's own trumpet, because when I was watching the football game in South Africa, I didn't know that blowing up the Vuvuzela is so difficult. But then, when I was in the crowd and I discovered that I was in the midst of all the people blowing it, I said, if I don't learn to do it, I will be disappointed, because I saw people blocking their ears. But I said, if I learn, I'll enjoy. And so I've learned a bit of that from South Africa.
So go ahead and play your Vuvuzela.
What is, it's not all that big on trade. And there are two things I want to suggest to you. One of them is that Africa trade has always been understated, particularly when we don't take into account the informal trade. I've seen a recent study which suggests that intra-regional trade will be as much as 7 to 10% more. And unless we start to show these pictures, we will be understating ourselves and also underselling. But I want to agree that some of the instruments which have been put in place for intra-African trade do not address these informal trade operators. We are talking about them. These are men and women at the borders who move these products each day across the borders. They are carrying only small consignments, but the rules are not looking after them. We design rules of what we talk about, banking instruments, insurance, but you don't know anything you're talking about. Let's address those issues when we see African trade. I never buy the idea that we're producing the same things. That's what we can trade. I go against that theory, because how do you see the German economy, UK economy, and Italy economy trading? The one may be producing a Mercedes, the other one is producing a Toyota or a Peugeot, but the consumer will decide to buy a Mercedes. So that is a concept for us to continue to think small. That okay, we're small, we're producing the same, we can never trade with each other. I never go against that. Let's change that also, that Africa can trade itself. We go back to the question, can Africa trade with itself? Yes, it can, because there are products that we can sell across each other. A few suggestions. I think World Bank and ourselves, we should finance maybe universities to get us these statistics on intra-African trade, bring more to the table, and policy instruments that can address and solve their problems. Regional blocks. I'm glad my colleague Maxwell has addressed it, but over the years, there has been this talk that, okay, countries belong to two main regional groupings. I don't think we should continue to provide the same medicine that we know the patient is not protected or it doesn't work. The answer is what you say, and I want to emphasize that. For a long time, theoretians and the people who produce these policy instruments, both from World Bank, I must say, and other universities, tell us, well, you can't have two customs unions. And it is only when we started challenging this theory that we found what could work. The idea of saying you can't have two customs unions is an intellectualist, like, you can say. What we need to say is that let's get these customs unions harmonized so that in the end you have the same things, because customs unions, you're talking of tariffs, you're talking of instruments. So if you're going to have East African customs union, maybe you have 4 bands. all 10 and 10, the SADC the same, the commercial one, you will stop talking about multiple membership. And it's only, I mean, if we continue to talk of the same thing which doesn't work, we will not move forward. Because countries belong to them for certain reasons. One, it may be political. Two, they see benefits. I give you one example. And it is real. Regional markets are now replacing world markets. You go to Kenya, I know now, look at their statistics. They are now trading more in the region than they trade with Europe or anywhere else. And why would they do that? It's because of East African Community and Commerce. If you go to them and tell them choose one, you are telling them to kill their trade in the other. But the answer is make commerce and East African Community converge so that they have the same and they go down the same road. But give them benchmark and let them move up, and that's what Maxwell should be doing. Now, the third system, the third one is what we gave us religion. The third one is let's create regional distribution systems. If we have multinationals like the one we've seen from South Africa, when they come and invest in a country, there is a natural tendency to resource from their countries. If we get some of them coming from Nigeria, from Egypt, from all these are going to be instruments. Because we know when you talk of multinational, granted, they will bring technology, they will bring trade, but they will still continue to trade with their home country. So let's have homegrown multinationals and we can facilitate. That to me is very important. Now, finally, then let me suggest one or two, three things. We need institutional framework to support regional trade. As he said, you can have infrastructure, but you do not have instruments which support and reduce costs. If, for example, you are trading in the region, you have to confirm your letters of credit via London from New York. Your costs are higher, leave alone the border costs, the customs problems and the rest. But if we have regional issues, like what Brazil was talking about, you have customs, that's what, and we have seen this working. I want to agree with what Rosa said, but we need to go further. Global trade has impact on us. Actually, current statistics are worrying. We have seen, for instance, regional trade declining because of the impact of, say, China. China is more cost effective. They can bring any product we talk about, whether it is cement, whether you're talking textiles, whether you're talking medicine or shoes, and outcompete in regional farm. Now, with that, we need to start looking at how do we have regional trade that is geared to encourage intra-regional trade. We don't have instruments for that. Unfortunately, practicing open regional has to be done in such a way. That's why I differ with you, because you are saying global solution. Let's start with regionalism and then we can make global. Because otherwise, we will never make it. With the other producers like China being stronger than African producers. It is a real fact. Okay, now the last point. And I want to come to you as well. Because if we are talking about instruments like what Rosa said, that encourage tax incentives for countries like US and AGOA, that they can encourage sourcing in Africa. That is extremely innovative, and we have to go that way. Because many countries always think of there will be a tax loss, but eventually it will gain. And I think the example she gave was powerful. But I want to tell you, if you look at whether it's MCC or the World Bank, your approach has been national, you are not regional. The reforms we are talking about the World Bank should also say, how can we now use regional integration as a platform for developing the infrastructure? That way we can then help the countries, because your focus itself, even in policy instruments, should be regional. That way we can then start talking of regions. Because the future, as you said in the morning, it's not the countries, it is Africa. And we better start seeing that happening also with the world.
Thank you. You've truly challenged us, guys. The reason that you heard him speaking so passionately and substantively on this issue is that before he became the deputy chair at the African Union Commission, he was the Secretary General of Commerce. So he knows his onion on this issue. So we do welcome all that you said, my dear brother Erastus. Now let's throw this open to the wider audience. Anyone wants to ask a question, make a comment? Yes, we've still got, with your agreement, of course, if we can take an additional 10 minutes, so we have 15 minutes in all, that would be great. Okay. Yes, I see the lady up there.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to all the panelists for such great insights. A positive comment was made, which was about BPO being seen as a sector that can, promote trade between the US and Africa. And I wish to say that as Africans, we welcome this idea because Africa has got all the right ingredients to make it a viable outsourcing destination. The question I want to pose is that internally within the US, we have seen some negative sentiments or negative comments, or what is called outsourcing bashing, which might contravene, the positive comments which have been, said. So how are we then going to reconcile the positive thought, which really creates an opportunity for a mode one trade in services between the US and Africa with what is being felt internally within the US? And Chair, if I may just beg your indulgence, you also said that we should come up with comments that we may have on some of the issues raised. So in terms of Africa, I also see an opportunity in Africa grouping itself to be able to provide these source markets through the languages that are offered in Africa. It's about time that we actually take colonization and make it work for us, in the sense that we have the Francophone countries, we have the Lusophone countries, and we have the Anglophone countries. And with the outsourcing boom, there is then an opportunity for Africa to group itself according to languages and services and service source markets, which are either in Europe or other parts of the world, which may be requiring this kind of language services. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We want to take more comments, more questions, more insights. I have such a large room of people. Surely there must be some more. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. I just like to emphasize a little bit on the importance of informal trade as raised by Erasmus Mwencha. I fully support his comments, and in Rwanda we have a real experience. Recently we made a census to have a clear idea of the importance of our exports to neighboring countries which were omitted from our official statistics, and we came up with an indication that these exports represent 25% of total exports of Rwanda in the global world. And I can tell you, just by making a few small investments by the government to support this move, such trade can increase 100% every year, because the potential is quite huge. And when we organize a workshop nationally to hear from those who are involved in such kind of trade, there is a huge need for government support to build a small infrastructure like markets, feeder roads, which can encourage dramatically such a kind of regional trade while waiting for this big infrastructure project we are talking about here.
Thank you so very much. And yes, do I see more hands across the room? Yes. Please use the microphone.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairperson, and I would like to thank all the panelists for the wonderful presentation. I just have just a minor comment. It's the issue of non-convertibility of our currencies. I think this is a very serious issue. No matter what we say about the trading among ourselves, if the currencies are as rigid and as non-convertible as they are, there will be little volumes in terms of the trading.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. There is a solution to the non-convertibility. And we have one amongst Zambia, Mozambique, and Malawi. This is called currency repatriation agreement. We have agreed that we will sign a tripartite agreement which along the borders our currencies will be convertible. You get your Malawi kwacha, you go get your Zambia kwacha on the border, you proceed. And the same thing in Mozambique. Instead of waiting for decisions to be implemented at the AU level, we can do it by facilitating rights as practitioners. We are central bankers, and we see the need to formalize what is already existing. This informal trade is already there, and we have no idea how much it is and all that. By formalizing that, we are able to know how much we're getting out of it. So the issue of decisions made at AU level or wherever, and practitioners putting that into practice,
thank you.
That can be done easily.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Let me just read one of the questions. By the way, we've been joined online by some 327 viewers who are using technology to follow this discussion that we're having today. One of the questions that came from the people that have joined us online was a question as to what role would the diaspora play in forcing this movement toward regional integration. Who wants to go for this? Come on, panelists. Yes, right.
I think it seems to me that there's a role for diaspora in the area of capital funding. We could have regions float a diaspora fund, and we'll have the diaspora invest in the fund. And that could have targeted, if we target that towards the SMEs, that could help to catalyze and further support the SMEs. The commentator there spoke about just basic infrastructure like markets, shops that we can provide and could have significant implications for the economic activities of this our segment. I think that's what I want.
That's excellent. Yes. When you're on the regional, on the diaspora, yes, please.
Diaspora is important to Africa at the moment because resources emitted is constituting a high percentage, particularly for the consumption sector. Unfortunately, we don't have good instruments at national level that can direct this investment because the diaspora will also embody with it technology. And therefore, development of strong instruments like banking that can use to move these equity funds and the rest for projects, for private partnership and so forth, so that these can participate through kind of bond mechanism is extremely important.
That's great. Let me draw in our chief economist in the Africa region into this conversation. Trenta, you've heard a couple of things thrown in our direction. I would like you to respond. I'd like you to particularly also talk to the issue of the informal sector and how much of an enigma this has been in the way that we're looking at our new strategy.
Thank you. Yes, a couple of comments, and then I will respond to some of the challenges thrown in our direction. I mean, Mr. Mwencha's point about informal trade being such a somewhat larger than formal trade, and you said something like we don't get enough credit for that. But you might want to ask the question slightly differently. Why is there so much informal trade? Usually it's to try to get around a barrier that already exists for the formal trade. So it actually is an indictment of the state of play that there are so many people who are trying to work around the system. We should try to reform the system. And I think this goes more broadly to what Obi was saying about the informal sector. there's a lot of talk about employment, particularly youth employment in Africa, and even phrases like jobless growth. It turns out that the fast-growing countries like Uganda, Tanzania, and so on, they're actually increasing jobs faster than GDP is growing in the formal sector. The problem is that's not enough, because you have a large number of young people entering the labor force because of high birth rates 15 years ago. So that, in fact, most of the people entering the labor force are still going into the informal sector, into very low productive jobs. And I think we've been focusing too much on the formal sector, manufacturing, industrialization, which is very important, but it's only going to be the tip of the iceberg. And we really need to focus on improving the productivity of the informal sector. The phrase I use is informal is normal. Let's get serious here, right? And try to focus our attention on that. And I think some of the diaspora points of it. Now, let me finally, I think Pravin Gordon mentioned one other thing in addition to trying to get every country to choose one rec to belong to. He mentioned something else which I think is really quite important. He said he wants every infrastructure project to be regional unless otherwise specified. I mean, if I think about this for the World Bank alone, that has profound implications. Because our typical reaction, because we're a country-based organization, is to do a country infrastructure project unless somebody comes up with a smart idea for a regional project. And I think just flipping that around, put the burden of proof, why do you want to do a country infrastructure project when you can do a regional one, could have really important implications for how we organize ourselves, how we structure ourselves. And I think we might want to take that seriously and go forward with that.
All right, thank you very much. I want to quickly give a last opportunity to Rosa, because the lady contributor had mentioned the business processing, outsourcing, an area that you're fast developing your linkages in.
Well, I want to say that you're absolutely right that outsourcing has become a pejorative word, but there is a way to get around it, and that's when you link it to development. Because when we did AGOA, trade was a terrible word because of the NAFTA and just the public sentiment about it. But we didn't sell AGOA based on trade. We sold it as a trade and investment-centered approach to development. And we made it for Africa only. So if you sell to the US politicians and the taxpayers and develop a constituency as a development dividend, as business services for development, for Africa only, I think it would be doable.
Thank you so very much. And this is the extent that we can take. I am not even going to try to summarize all that you have heard. But I believe that like me, you do go away knowing that some job has been cut out for our AU commissioner, as well as the deputy chairman, and that there would be a consideration of all the decisions that have thus far been made, and a deliverable package as well as timeline that will be presented to the presidents at the next AU summit perhaps to work toward action. And then in terms of the private sector, I think what Tony and Bill have been able to put a focus on is that the opportunities in Africa are really there. The opportunities are evident. Evidence really shows that any company that's not thinking Africa now is not thinking with the right strategy. And what Rosa has basically put on the table is that when trade incentives are available, that investments do flow to Africa. And so how we can move from AGOA to super AGOA to dragging in everybody under that umbrella is going to be important. And I really want to thank every one of you for staying with us during the course of this discussion. And for those who joined us online, thank you very much. And please keep the engagement going, because we have a website that is helping us to continue discussions of this kind. And by the way, please go visit our website on the renewal of our Africa region strategy. Thank you very much.